Jaden Carter had always been a dreamer. At just 12 years old, his mind was filled with endless possibilities, whether it was becoming an astronaut, an inventor, or even a professional artist. His mother, Camille, often reminded him, "Your mind is your greatest tool, baby. Don't let anybody make you feel small." But in the halls of Crestwood Middle School, Jaden was already learning that some people didn't care about his mind. He was small for his age, with deep brown skin, soft curls that his mother kept neatly shaped, and wide, curious eyes that soaked in everything. His father used to say he had an old soul, always asking big questions about the world. Jaden's heart was filled with a quiet confidence at home. But at school, that confidence often shrank under the weight of feeling different. Moving to a new town in rural Ohio had been tough. His family had relocated from Atlanta after his father, a mechanical engineer, landed a new job. Unlike their old neighborhood, Crestwood was overwhelmingly white. Jaden was one of only 3 black students in the entire 7th grade. That fact alone made him feel like he was always being watched, always standing out when all he wanted was to blend in. Each morning, Jaden followed the same routine. He'd wake up at 6:30 a.m., shuffle to the bathroom, brush his teeth while half asleep, and let the warm water wake him up as he showered. Breakfast was always something quick, usually a bowl of cereal or toast with peanut butter, which he ate in silence while his mom hummed along to the morning news. The school bus ride was the worst part of his day. The moment he stepped onto the bus, he could feel the shift, the way conversations slowed, how heads turned just slightly as if his presence was a disruption. He'd slip into his seat near the middle, plug in his earbuds, and stare out the window, hoping no one would bother him. At school, things weren't much better. Crestwood Middle was a pristine, brick-faced building with a sprawling green field and hallways that smelled like old textbooks and floor polish. The classrooms were filled with neatly arranged desks, motivational posters about perseverance, and a sea of faces that rarely looked like his. Lunchtime was particularly lonely. While other kids clustered together, laughing and chatting, Jaden often sat by himself or with the only other black student in his grade, a quiet girl named Olivia. They weren't exactly friends, just 2 people who understood each other's silent struggle. There was an unspoken rule at Crestwood. If you weren't part of the in crowd, you were invisible unless someone decided to make you a target. Jaden had quickly learned that no matter how hard he tried to stay in the background, some kids wouldn't let him. It started with small things. A whisper as he walked past, a snicker when he answered a question in class, the occasional joke about his hair or the way he spoke. "Why do you talk so proper? You trying to be white?" Someone had once sneered. Jaden didn't even know how to respond. His mother had always told him to hold his head high, but it wasn't easy when he felt like he was carrying a weight on his back. Every day, it grew heavier. One afternoon, as Jaden stood at his locker, a group of boys, Ethan, Ryan, and Jake, walked past him. Ethan, the self-proclaimed leader, smirked and whispered something to the others. They laughed. Jaden pretended not to notice, but he felt his stomach twist. "Hey, Carter," Ethan called out. "How's life in the jungle?" Jaden stiffened. He turned slightly, locking eyes with Ethan, who grinned like he had just told the funniest joke in the world. Jaden wanted to say something, anything, but his throat tightened. He just shook his head, slammed his locker shut, and walked away. He knew it wouldn't end there. Bullies like Ethan never stopped at just words. Something worse was coming. He could feel it. Jaden had learned to ignore the whispers, the stares, and even the occasional muttered insults. But ignoring something didn't make it disappear. It just built up, little by little, until it had nowhere to go. It happened on a Thursday, just before lunch. Jaden was in the hallway, heading to the cafeteria, when he felt it, a sudden, forceful shove from behind. He stumbled forward, nearly dropping his tray. Laughter erupted behind him. "Oops," Ethan said mockingly, his voice dripping with fake innocence. "Didn't see you there, Carter." Jaden clenched his jaw. He kept walking, his heart hammering. He knew if he reacted, it would only make things worse. But Ethan wasn't done. "Where you going, huh? You scared?" Ryan jeered. "Gonna run and tell the teacher?" The laughter grew louder. Jaden's hands tightened into fists. Then came the final blow. Jake, the quietest of the group, but no less cruel, muttered, "Bet your dad isn't even around." That's how you people are, right? The words hit Jaden like a punch to the gut. His father, the man who tucked him in at night, who taught him how to ride a bike, who reminded him every day that he was special, was the strongest man he knew. And these boys, these ignorant, hateful boys, thought they could reduce him to a stereotype. Jaden's vision blurred. His body trembled with anger. But he refused to let them win. With every ounce of strength he had, he turned away and walked to the cafeteria, ignoring the mocking laughter behind him. Jaden sat alone at lunch, his appetite gone. His hand shook as he picked at his food. The humiliation sat heavy in his chest. Across the cafeteria, Olivia watched him. After a moment, she stood up and walked over. "Hey," she said quietly. "You okay?" Jaden hesitated before shrugging. "I'm used to it." "No, you're not," she said. "And you shouldn't have to be." He looked up at her, surprised. Olivia rarely spoke up about anything. She was just like him, always trying to keep her head down. But now, there was something firm in her expression. "Mrs. Peterson sees what's happening," she said. "I've noticed. I think she wants to help." Jaden frowned. Mrs. Peterson was their homeroom and English teacher. She was different from the other teachers, young, energetic, and the only one who actually seemed to care about more than just grades. But Jaden had learned a long time ago not to trust adults to fix things. "It won't change anything," he muttered. Olivia sighed. "Maybe not, but maybe it will." What Jaden didn't know was that Mrs. Peterson had seen everything. She had been standing near the teacher's lounge when Ethan and his friends cornered Jaden in the hallway. She had heard the words, seen the shove, and watched the way Jaden swallowed his pain. And she had had enough. That night, Mrs. Peterson sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over her laptop keyboard. She knew reporting the boys wouldn't be enough. They'd get a slap on the wrist, maybe a warning, and the cycle would continue. No, this needed to be bigger. This needed to mean something. Taking a deep breath, she started typing. The next morning, Jaden walked into English class, feeling the same weight he always carried. He moved to his seat quickly, avoiding eye contact with Ethan, Ryan, and Jake, who were snickering in the back of the classroom. Olivia gave him a small nod, but he barely acknowledged it. He just wanted to get through the day. Then, Mrs. Peterson did something unexpected. Instead of beginning class with their usual grammar exercises, she walked to the front of the room, her face unusually serious. She glanced around, her sharp eyes landing momentarily on Ethan and his friends before scanning the rest of the class. "Before we begin today's lesson," she said, "I want to talk about something important." The class quieted. Mrs. Peterson never started with lectures like this. She turned to the whiteboard and wrote a single word in bold, black marker. "Empathy." Jaden felt his heart speed up. "Who can tell me what this means?" she asked. A girl in the front row raised her hand. "It means understanding how someone else feels." "Exactly," Mrs. Peterson said. "Empathy is the ability to step into someone else's shoes, to imagine their struggles, to recognize their pain. But the real question is, how often do we actually practice empathy?" She let the question hang in the air. The class was silent. Jaden could feel the tension growing. He knew exactly where this was going. Mrs. Peterson walked over to her desk and picked up a small stack of papers. "Last night, I read a story," she said. "A true story. And today, I want you all to read it too." She started handing out the papers. Jaden took his copy and froze. His breath caught in his throat. The story was about him. Mrs. Peterson had changed the names, but the details were unmistakable. The bullying in the hallway, the cruel jokes, the feeling of isolation. Every word on the page felt like a mirror reflecting Jaden's pain. The class read in silence. The mood had shifted, no longer casual, no longer playful. Some students glanced at Jaden. Others looked down, shame flickering in their expressions. Ethan, Ryan, and Jake shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jaden could see it, the way their faces tightened, their hands fidgeting. When everyone was finished, Mrs. Peterson spoke again. "This is what happens when we ignore empathy," she said. "This is what happens when words become weapons." She looked directly at Ethan. "This is real." For the first time, Ethan didn't have a snarky remark. The room erupted. "That's messed up," one student muttered, shaking her head. Wait, who is this even about? Another asked, though his voice lacked sincerity. A boy near the back crossed his arms. This isn't fair. Why are we being punished for something we didn't do? Olivia, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. Because letting it happen is just as bad. The tension in the room thickened. Some students nodded in agreement. Others avoided looking at anyone. Ethan's jaw clenched. This is stupid, he muttered under his breath. Mrs. Peterson, as calm as ever, folded her arms. You think so? Ethan hesitated. Yeah, I mean, people joke around all the time. It's not that deep. Jaden felt his chest tighten. He knew Ethan would try to minimize it, pretend it was nothing. But it was something. Mrs. Peterson didn't back down. If it's not that deep, then why do some people have to carry it with them long after the joke is over? Ethan didn't have an answer. Jaden sat frozen in his chair. Part of him wanted to disappear. Part of him wanted to stand up and scream. He wanted to ask Ethan if he had any idea what it was like to wake up dreading the day ahead. To feel invisible until someone decided to make you the center of their cruelty. To have to be stronger than you should have to be at 12 years old. Instead, he said nothing. Mrs. Peterson's eyes landed on Jaden. Would you like to say anything? She asked gently. Jaden hesitated. He could feel the entire class watching him, waiting. Finally, he swallowed hard and shook his head. No. Mrs. Peterson nodded, as if she understood. That's okay, she said. But I want everyone to take this lesson seriously. You never know how much damage a few words can do. The bell rang, cutting through the tension like a knife. The students filed out slowly, murmuring to one another. Olivia gave Jaden a small, encouraging smile before heading to the door. Ethan and his friends, however, hung back. Jaden braced himself. Ethan walked up to Jaden's desk, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Jaden thought he might apologize. But instead, Ethan just scoffed and shook his head. You think this changes anything? He muttered. You think people actually care? Jaden met his gaze, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. He didn't respond, but he didn't look away either. Ethan smirked, but there was something different in his eyes. Something uncertain. Then he turned and walked out, Ryan and Jake trailing behind him. Jaden exhaled slowly. This wasn't over. Not yet. Jaden knew the lesson in English class had changed something. He could feel it in the way people looked at him now, not with mockery, but with curiosity, maybe even guilt. Some students who had once ignored him now seemed hesitant, as if unsure of what to say. Olivia had started walking with him to class, making it clear she was on his side. But Ethan, Ryan, and Jake? They weren't done. Jaden found that out the hard way. It happened 2 days later, after school. Jaden had stayed behind in the library, finishing up an assignment. By the time he left, the halls were nearly empty. As he stepped outside, he felt the uneasy sensation of being watched. He barely had time to react before he was shoved, hard, against a brick wall near the side of the building. His backpack slipped off his shoulder, landing in the dirt. Ethan stood in front of him, his jaw clenched. Ryan and Jake flanked him, their faces twisted in smug amusement. You thought you were smart, huh? Ethan spat. Thought you could turn the whole class against us? Jaden's heart pounded. He clenched his fists, willing himself not to show fear. I didn't do anything, he said, his voice steady. Ethan let out a cold laugh. Yeah? Then why is everyone acting different? Why is everyone looking at us like we're the bad guys? Maybe because you are. Jaden shot back before he could stop himself. Ryan and Jake both let out low whistles. Ethan's eyes darkened. You think this is funny? He stepped closer, and, for a second, Jaden thought Ethan was actually going to hit him. But instead, Ethan just sneered. You're still nothing, Jaden. One stupid lesson isn't going to change that. Jaden felt something shift inside him. A fire, a defiance he hadn't let himself feel before. Then why are you so scared? He asked quietly. Ethan froze. Jaden saw it. The flicker of insecurity in Ethan's eyes. The brief crack in his confidence. For the first time, Jaden realized the truth. Ethan wasn't strong. He was weak. He needed to push others down to feel powerful. And now, for the first time, his power was slipping. The silence between them stretched. Ethan's face twisted in frustration, but before he could say anything else, a voice cut through the tension. "Hey, what's going on here?" Jaden turned. Mrs. Peterson. She stood a few feet away, her arms crossed. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that made Ethan step back immediately. "We were just talking," Ethan muttered, stuffing his hands in his pockets. Mrs. Peterson didn't buy it for a second. She looked at Jaden. "Are you okay?" Jaden hesitated. Every instinct told him to say yes, to avoid trouble, to keep his head down like always. But then he thought about everything that had happened, about the way Ethan had pushed him, mocked him, tried to make him feel small. He thought about what Mrs. Peterson had taught them in class. He straightened his shoulders. "No," he said firmly. "I'm not." Ethan stiffened. Ryan and Jake shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Peterson's gaze never left Ethan. "Office. Now." Ethan's nostrils flared. "Are you serious?" "Go," she repeated. "All three of you." Ryan and Jake didn't argue. Ethan lingered for a second longer, his face red with anger, before turning on his heel and storming off. Jaden let out a slow breath. Mrs. Peterson looked at him again. "You did the right thing, Jaden." For the first time, he believed it. The next day at school, everything felt different. Word had spread fast about what had happened. Ethan, Ryan, and Jake had been suspended for 2 weeks. Some students were shocked. Others weren't surprised at all. But the biggest shift was in Jaden himself. He wasn't invisible anymore. When he walked into English class, Olivia smiled at him. A few other students gave him small nods, acknowledgement, respect. Mrs. Peterson didn't make a big deal out of what had happened. But when Jaden sat down, she met his eyes and gave him the slightest nod. And that was enough. Because for the first time in a long time, Jaden didn't feel like he had to shrink himself to fit in. For the first time, he felt seen. The hallways of Crestwood Middle School felt different now. The usual laughter and chatter still filled the air, but something had shifted. Jaden wasn't sure what he had expected after Ethan and his friends were suspended. He had thought maybe things would go back to normal, that people would still ignore him, that nothing would really change. But that wasn't what happened. Instead, something new filled the spaces where the old silence had been. Not fear, not shame, respect. Students who had once overlooked him now acknowledged him. Some still kept their distance, unsure of what to say, but others offered nods of approval. Olivia stayed by his side more often now, no longer just an acquaintance, but a real friend. And then there were the whispers, except this time, they weren't mocking. "Did you hear what he said to Ethan? I didn't think he'd actually stand up to them. He's braver than I thought." Jaden didn't let it go to his head. He knew he hadn't done anything extraordinary. He had just told the truth. But for the first time, it felt like that truth actually mattered. Mrs. Peterson had changed everything. After Ethan's suspension, she started a new class project, one that had nothing to do with English grammar or literature. She called it The Change We Create. "Each of you," she said, standing in front of the class, "is going to pick something you want to change about the world, big or small, and create a plan to make it happen." Some students groaned at the idea of another assignment, but Jaden sat up straighter. He knew exactly what he wanted to do. His project was called Voices That Matter. It was a simple idea, an anonymous journal where students could write about their experiences with bullying, racism, or feeling like they didn't belong. Mrs. Peterson would collect the entries and, with permission, share some with the class to help start conversations. When Jaden presented his idea, the class was quiet. He expected eye rolls, maybe even laughter. Instead, Olivia was the first to speak. "I think it's great." A few others murmured in agreement. Even students who had never spoken to Jaden before nodded along. By the end of the week, Mrs. Peterson had placed a decorated box in the back of the classroom for the anonymous entries. And within days, it was already full. Jaden read some of the stories in Mrs. Peterson's classroom after school one day. One was from a girl who had been teased for her weight. Another was from a boy who never spoke in class because he was scared of being laughed at. One letter, and signed, simply said, "I never thought anyone cared about this stuff. But maybe I was wrong." Jaden exhaled. Maybe he'd been wrong too. Maybe standing up did make a difference. It wasn't just about what happened to him. It was about what happened to all of them. Jaden walked home that afternoon with Olivia. the crisp autumn air brushing against his skin. "Do you think Ethan's going to come back and act like nothing happened?" she asked. Jaden thought about it. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I don't think I care anymore." Olivia gave him a curious look. "Why not?" Jaden smiled just a little. "Because it doesn't change who I am." And for the first time, he truly believed it. That night, Jaden sat at his desk, staring at a blank notebook page. Then, slowly, he picked up his pen and wrote. "For so long, I thought silence was the answer. That if I just ignored things, they would go away. But silence doesn't make things disappear. It just gives them more power." He paused, then continued. "I used to think I was alone. I know now that I never was." He closed the notebook, feeling lighter than he had in months. Because this time he knew his voice mattered.